They're smooth, soft, you can have a lot of fun with them, and everybody likes them. Let's talk about curves. Alright, so this is what we're gonna talk about today, to be found by clicking here. And first of all, we're gonna have a brief look about where to find those curves, which curves are available, and how they actually are represented. So first of all, first thing we want to know is how to get there. That's by just clicking down here in the middle on this tiny curve icon. Then we can select our curves either by clicking those icons here, or once we click on that drop down menu, we find the hue, hue set, and so on, those curves around here. As always, curves can be reset clicking this tiny icon here, and we can also undock the curves, which might be quite helpful or handy if we want to make very targeted adjustments. Okay, so for the sake of the tutorial, let's stay with our curves out here. What is a curve? Well, a curve is a 2-axis representation of a given property of our image. So in case of our custom curves here, this is luma versus luma. So one axis and another axis. So on this axis, we can see our luma values versus the other luma values. And this means that, first of all, when we have a straight line connected from the down left to the up right corner of our graph, there's nothing actually happening. Now, let's swap over to our luma chart and see what the histogram inside here shows us. So we can go over there and tell us whether the histogram displays the input, so whether those tiny things display the input or the output, or whether we don't want any histogram at all, so we can work with the curves only. So that's the output. And the first thing you're gonna notice is that when we do no changes to a curve, of course the input is the same as the output. So that's the first thing we want to notice. And this means that once we have a vertical line that just connects our blackest black to the whitest white, there is actually nothing happening to the image. So once we start adding points by clicking on it, we can now drag those points up and down. And if we take a look at a waveform monitor, we can see that we're shifting around the image. Essentially what we're doing is, here we say, okay, at a certain lightness value, so this value, this lightness value, which corresponds to our lightest values over here, we take them and we then make those values lighter or darker. And as you can see, since the curves connect all those points with one single line, all the other points are affected as well. Now, say we don't want that, then we could just reset that for once, and then place our first point, and then click to another point while we're holding down the Alt button, and another one on the other side. And you can see that when I drag this one down here a little and click here, that it snaps to the line connecting those 2 points out there. But still, what we can see is that there are some overshoots, and if we want to change that, we will have to go over here and say, okay, editable splines, and then we get some Bezier curves, and we can align them so that this actually does not affect the area down here again. So the same goes for up there. And then we've already learned something we can use from now on, which are those editable splines, which we can activate and deactivate whenever we want. That allows us to actually do very precise changes to the graph in here. Okay, so what do we know so far? we have a resemblance of our first axis that resembles the Luma curve versus the second axis. So, or in other words, the second axis, the Luma, is plotted versus the Luma. And we can now go in there and change certain values depending on another value. Just like in school when we learned that some function f of x is something a times x or something like that, which is pretty much the same thing that we can see here. But in this case, we're not using a mathematical function, but we can actually freely drag those values around. And in principle, this is our x-axis, and here we have then a times x. So once we reset it, so that's pretty much a times x, where a is some constant value. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, let's move on to the other curves we have. All right, next one is hue versus hue. So this means that we can pick a particular hue. We can do that by, for example, clicking in here, and then it adds us a point at the respective hue that we just clicked, and then shift it. And then we can see that for a certain hue on the x-axis, we can just change the color up there. And we can already see that it does affect the neighboring hues. If you take a look at this tiny part here and that one, we can see that the one we picked before, so the upper X, is affected most, but also the neighboring colors are affected. And that's because our curves are smooth, so they do a smooth connection between the points we choose on the graph. And we could also go over here and say, okay, shift all of those colors. You know, that's pretty much how those curves work. So hue versus hue picks a certain hue, and then you can shift it around. Hue versus sat is again the same thing. So we can pick a certain hue, pick that one, and then saturate it more or saturate it less. And you can see once I completely desaturate it, it goes gray. Of course, when I saturate it fully, well, we only have that hue at full saturation. Pretty obvious. All right, next one is hue versus lum. So let me briefly reset the other ones. Okay. So hue versus luma. So again, we can choose a certain hue on the x-axis. Let's choose, I don't know, let's choose the brown one. For example, you see by clicking those patches here or clicking anywhere in the image, actually, we're adding a point plus two other points somewhere here on the hue versus lum chart. We can also add points by clicking those standard points down here, which coincide actually with the patches on the chart right now. What a surprise. So standard points are chart, are standard points inside here. And then it gives us only those points without the handles that restrict the area. Yeah, all right. So if, for example, we picked one of those points and accidentally shifted it along the y-axis, we can go back here and say, okay, reset the luma gain. And then we have reset the luma gain to the x-axis, so there's no change applied to that particular hue. So say if you just want to shift the hue and then want to reset that, just reset the luma gain and we're back to 1 again. All right, the same goes of course for all the other charts as well. You can then reset the saturation gain, you can reset the hue rotation, all that. All right, the next one is lum versus sat. So that one is pretty interesting because again here we can pick a certain luma value. So let's say we pick that one, or actually even let's pick one from here, I don't know, that one for example, and then shift it up and down, and we can affect the saturation of certain luma levels. And that's pretty interesting because in fact that allows us to go into an image and pick out certain areas that are in a way qualified by lightness and then shift those up and down. And that can help us quite a lot when it comes to separating foreground from background, or if you have something that actually peeks out in the background because it's very bright, you can then start to desaturate it and in another step bring down the lightness. But in the first step you can qualify sort of by Luma and reduce the saturation, because that makes it pop out less to the eye. And well, that's a way to manipulate your image, so to draw the attention of the viewer to what's more important. Or in another way, you could qualify a face that is usually falling inside a certain Luma value and then pull up the saturation to, in that way, focus the viewer's eyes towards that face by increasing saturation there. Alright, next one is saturation versus saturation, and that one comes in super handy when you want to control saturation. So for example, if you have very saturated areas in the image, all over the image, and you want to reduce that, you just pick the highest part, and again here, well, we can add some standard point in the middle, but we can also go over here. Oops, yeah, I activated those editable splines, which in those curves happen to be down there. Now they're deactivated again, and I'm resetting that chart. So, alright, so we can set a point here, and if we look down at our histogram, so the tiny thing here, we can see that actually where I just placed the point doesn't really make sense. So we'd go down here, add some points there, and then maybe say, okay, we don't want those more saturated areas to be very saturated at all. Drag it down, and now we can see the saturation dropping off, and then we could also add those Bezier curves and try to make this a little smoother, like this for example, and we can see we've just controlled the overall saturation in the image by making very targeted adjustments. Alright, so just working with the chart here. Alright, next one is, last one actually already, is the saturation versus luminance. And that's just the opposite of luminance versus saturation. So this time we can go in there and say, okay, we're having our saturation along there, and we got our luminance along the y-axis, and we can make certain parts of the image that have a certain saturation brighter or darker. So for example, if you have some particular green foliage, for example, inside your image, and you say, I don't like that very much, you just go over here, well, set the luminance, restrict that area a little and make it darker or make it lighter. So in this case, we're of course also affecting all the other patches that fall into the same saturation range. So we have to be careful with that. But if you have something that is very specific in luminance because it's very dark or very light, or because there's just nothing else inside the image, you could always work with that to, well, yeah, increase the luminance of this area. And you can also see by, well, let's take a look at the vector scope, because you can also see that by shifting those values towards darker values, you actually also increase saturation. By shifting them towards lighter values, we reduce saturation. And yeah, that's actually something to keep in mind when you're shifting around lightness values, that darker values usually are more saturated, whereas lighter values lose saturation in that respect. Alright, if you compare it to the Luma versus saturation curve, here we can now bring in saturation back into those patches that we before made lighter. Okay, let's go back to the custom curves, because those custom curves are usually the curves you're gonna find yourself working with quite a lot, and I'd say maybe even a lot more than with the other ones. So, and we've already talked about how to add and by middle click removing those points. So actually I haven't told you that yet, but you can just do middle click and remove those points again. And you can also alt click to have those points snap to the standard line. All right. So what's special about the Luma curves is that you can't just, or the custom curves, which I'm referring to as Luma curve for some reason, but they're actually more than Luma curves, because what you can do is actually select the individual channels here. So if you select the Luma only channel, then of course Luma only is affected. So let me briefly reset that, and then add some points somewhere here maybe. And then the Luma only is affected. So if you take a look at the parade over here and take a look at the individual channels, and we're working in the Luma curve, all channels are affected uniformly. So there's no change in how those individual channels are spaced with respect to one another. But what we can also do is work in the individual channels. So we can go into the red channel and say, okay, let's have a little more red in the midtones, for example, and bring in more red here, or take away some red. And we can do that for the blue and the green channel as well. And then we can also increase or lower the gain for the individual channels. And if we go over here, add in some red, and then decrease it, then we'll notice that for around 50, there's nothing happening at all. And if we go below 50, we're actually doing the opposite of what we've done with the curve inside our curves window. All right, so the other thing that we can do inside here, well, let's use all channels again, is soft clipping or hard clipping. Well, we can do both. So I'll bring back in the waveform here, and we'll just take a look at what it does. So with low, we can actually hard clip the lowest value inside our image. So if we bring that up, we're bringing up the lowest values that are allowed in the image, and that's pretty much the same as to say, okay, we're taking the bottom of our graph and we're dragging it up here. So that's pretty much say, okay, our blackest value is going up to somewhat, I don't know, let's say 15% IRE, and there's nothing that's darker than 15% IRE. And that's the same as to just rise the low slider down here. In a way, actually, if we take another chart, we can see it better, that this low slider does not work just the same than what I just did with the curve. Because if you take a closer look, if we push up the low slider here, we're affecting the entire image, because we're just shifting up the curve and every value in here is compressed. Whereas when we take the low slider at the soft clip, we're really just clipping away the darkest parts. So the difference here is that dragging up the curve drags up the entire thing and compresses all those values and their relative spacing. So everything gets lighter, just the amount by which it gets lighter changes. Whereas when we're working with the low slider, we're literally drawing a line here or there or wherever, and we say everything that's below that line just gets cut away and is set to the value of whatever value we're setting in the low slider. Okay, so the same thing is also true for the high slider, but in order to make you see this, I've in the first node just here increased the value of our highlights so that they're pushed even further up, so we can have very bright highlights. And then in the second node over here, I can now lower the high slider and we can see that this affects the brightest values and again just clips them hard. Now hard clipping is something that we probably want to avoid in a lot of cases, and since that's the case, there's also two other ways to manipulate our image. So the first one is the high soft, which gives us some sort of soft clipping, and this can be emulated by dragging this down a little here and then pulling it up there, and maybe then again using the luma curve, have it snap somewhere down there, so that we're sort of getting some smooth curve up here and then shift it a little down, so we're landing somewhere there. And the same can be done for the shadows, and what this gives us is actually some smoother roll off in the highlights and some smoother crushing in the blacks. And for the sake of showing you the thing for the blacks, I'll just reset that one quickly and head over here and then reset it again and add some low softness, and that's again the same thing. So here we're again pushing this up a little, set that, pushing this up a little, and then give it some slight S curve down here, so we have some smoother roll off to the shadows. So that's the before, that's the after, and you can see that we're sort of rolling in smoothly here, if you want to say so. And we have, in a way, smoothed out our shadow contrast, while the highlights contrast still remains. And that's of course something you can tackle in various ways, but the soft clipping area is just an easy way to quickly fix those issues. And if, for example, you have very harsh highlights or very crushed shadows that you want to lighten a little bit, that's a... Alright, so one thing you want to say now is that, okay, apparently if I'm going into the curves and I'm selecting a certain color, well, let's select that one, and then I change it, for example, by shifting the saturation or the hue. I could as well also go over there into the qualifier, qualify that certain area, smooth it accordingly, and then by having a look at this, maybe smooth it even out further, softer now, and soft, and even more soft, and so on. Then apply the corresponding changes that correspond to a hue shift by, for example, shifting the hue here, or adding in some saturation, or whichever change you want to do. So where's the benefit of using a curve now? Well, in a certain way, there's two benefits you get from this. First of all, with those curves, of course, you can do multiple adjustments in one image, which reduces the entire nodes you will need, because you can take, for example, well, I don't know, some red and add in some saturation, some yellow and drag out some saturation, and you can do all that within one curve, and you're gonna have a quick overview also if you're going in there which changes you've actually done. So that's a minor advantage. You can say, okay, I'm on a nice workstation anyway, so it really doesn't matter how many nodes I do. That may be true for most, actually. The other thing is that, and that's what I consider the big advantage, you can actually customize those curves very well. Meaning that by adding those Bezier curves, you can change the shape of the curve. So you can make a sharper correction, or one that's just not as sharp, or you may even add some overshoots like I'm doing in here, or yeah, you can just do pretty much whatever you want to do here. And the thing about curves is that the adjustment you're doing with those is smooth. So you always have smooth curves in there, or at least as long as DaVinci Resolve can somehow fit something smooth through there. And when you make a selection, even if you smooth out the selection, the smoothest thing you're gonna get in a way is for a certain value you have a sharp change in contrast. So that's pretty much the border of our selection. So we're selecting a certain area inside our image. And then for the blurred or softened area, that's just a linear decay. So in strength of adjustment versus selected area, so we have that area down here is selected, then we have a certain fall off area, which is that area here, that we usually have a linear fall off, and then we have the area that's just not selected anymore, and that's that, and there's nothing applied here. So with the curves, that's kind of similar, but you can already spot the difference by just looking at the curve, because with the curve it's pretty much like this. You have the point that you got selected, and then you have the adjustment in the shape that you draw to the point where nothing is selected anymore, and then nothing happens. So if you want to compare that, there's only just one point down here that's really selected, and then we have the entire area between that point and the beginning of the area that does not see any changes. And with the curve we can customize what the fall off region looks like between those 2 points. And that's pretty much the essential difference between curves and qualifiers, because with the curves we can customize the fall off region, but we do not have those geometric tools to actually restrict the area. Whereas with the qualifiers, we do have a lot of geometric restrictions that we can apply to the selected area and then work with those. So of course, the optimal way is to probably combine those two approaches. So we can first make a selection based on the, well, maybe even combine it with masks as well. So we can first make a selection based on colors and area inside our image, but then also customize the way our values inside are really affected and how they fall off. And yeah, that's pretty much the strength of curves. So with curves you can go in somewhere where you can't make those nice qualifications, for example, because you don't have the bit depth, and by using the smoothness that curves actually supply, you can get away with a little more than you might get away with the HSL qualifiers. So yeah, that's pretty much one big advantage of curves. Okay, now, so what's the fuss about? So actually I wanted to show you in some sort of real world example from a narrative short we recently shot, what you could use those curves for example. And actually I'm just gonna show you, or you can already see the finished shot, so that's what you're gonna see in full screen right now. And now that's one correction I did with curves, so the last correction, and that's the before and that's the after. And what I went for here was to first of all desaturate this area over here, which can be done by a hue versus set versus hue curve, set versus hue. And then I also targeted her face, so I targeted specifically the darker area and similar areas, and just added some extra contrast in the face, and that's just a standard custom curve. And now let's just see that one in action. So that's the before. And I think that actually that red area here is quite distracting. Plus I'd like my view to actually focus around here. And if I click inside there, that's actually what happens, because that red area is far less distracting to my eye right now. And also I'm drawn to the lighter areas in here, which is what directs my eye towards merely that bigger area here where I can find her eye. And as humans, we sort of are natural drawn to several key properties, which are namely sharpness, saturation, lightness, and properties that we recognize as human. So in this image, we actually have a eye that's in focus, and we have light areas around that eye, with also quite some contrast around, so dark areas here. It actually sort of competes a little bit with that lighter back area here, which we could also fix if we wanted to, but I actually wanted that back area to also have some sort of vividness, so it wouldn't look all that muted, so there's something left inside the frame. But my main idea was to actually focus the viewer towards this eye. And well, now let's take a look at the node tree. So that's the first basic corrections here, so I'll disable the first one. So that's what I did first. So I brought up pretty much all that area here and made it a little lighter, added in some saturation, actually shifted around the colors a little bit to get a more neutral look. So yeah, so that's something I did before, but then I found still, as I said, that the red area was too distracting, and that's when I put in those curves. And let's just take a brief look in there. And what I actually did was, first of all, was using that hue versus saturation curve. So DaVinci Resolve names those a little weird because as I know it, you'd say that's A versus B, but in this case we actually have the saturation, which is our A, so there's the saturation versus the different hues in here, so we can actually pick certain hues, and that's pretty much what I did in here. So I picked the red hue over there, and that's just that point that I marked here, and then I actually dragged it down, so you can also see what happens. The red area gets desaturated and is far less competing with the other areas around for our eye. And then the other step was to create a custom curve, which again, I put the eyedropper here, so in the dark area of your face, and even darkened those dark areas a little more to create some more contrast in the eye around here, so that we'd have a fall off towards that side or more lightness directed towards the eye. All right, so that's some real world example of how you could use those curves as a sort of secondary adjustment. You can of course also use your custom curves to do the first contrast adjustment, as which one I used the wheels over here in the compound node, but that of course can be done with curves as well. Just it's a matter of feel and what you're comfortable with, what you are working faster with. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, as always, if you found our video helpful, we appreciate your support. So maybe you consider leaving us a like or subscribing to our channel. We're even quite happy if you maybe share this to a friend colorist or someone just starting out in coloring. And as always, if you have any topics that you'd like to see covered, just leave us a note. If there are any questions concerning this video, just write us and we'll try to answer them. And well, until then, catch you next time and happy grading.